three young women stood before a textile factory for a photograph in 1912, never imagining what would happen next. A century later, researchers examined the image closely and discovered something that left them amazed. The Loray mill was filled with the loud noise of machines, and cotton dust floated through the poorly aired rooms. Pearl Turner fixed her dress and stood up straight. The man with the camera had told them to come outside for a short break. "Come on, Pearl." Her older sister, Viola, called out, smoothing her simple work dress. "Mr. Hine told us we can't leave our workstations for too long." "I'm coming right now," Pearl answered, trying not to cough as they walked into the fresh air outside. Pearl was only 9 years old, though she would soon turn 10, but she had already worked at the mill for 3 years. Her small hands had learned how to work the dangerous spinning machines. Louis Hine, the photographer, placed the three girls in front of the mill's office building. Pearl stood on the left side, her dark eyes showing wisdom beyond her young age and a serious expression. Viola, who was 14, looked tired in a way that seemed to come from deep inside her, and she stood on the right. Mary Ashworth, a 12-year-old girl from the neighborhood who worked on the same floor, stood between them. "Don't move now, Mr. Hine said, disappearing under the black cloth that covered his camera. A moment later, there was a bright flash, and the three girls' faces were captured forever, three young, stiff faces standing in front of the workplace that took away their childhood. None of them knew that this single photograph would last for more than 100 years and would later reveal something shocking to science. Pearl took one last look at the photographer before following her sister back into the mill, which was full of constant noise and floating cotton dust that would cause serious problems in the future. More than 100 years later, Dr. Margaret Hamilton looked up from her computer and saw her research helper, William Thompson, standing in her doorway. He was holding a folder and looked very excited. "What did you discover?" she asked, taking off her reading glasses. William Thompson walked to her desk and opened the folder. "This is from the Louis Hine photograph collection that we're putting into digital format," he explained. "This picture is from 1912, 3 mill girls in Gastonia." Dr. Margaret Hamilton looked at the image carefully. She saw 3 young girls with serious faces standing in front of what looked like an office. "What's special about it?" she asked. "We've seen hundreds of Hine's photographs of child workers. Look at this girl," William Thompson said, pointing to the one on the left. "According to Hine's notes, this is Pearl Turner. She wasn't even 10 years old yet, but she had already been working at the mill for 3 years. But that's not the most interesting part," he continued, turning to another document. "I found her death record. She lived until 1964. That's very unusual for mill workers from that time, especially ones who started working so young. And there's more. We have records of interviews with her children from 2006 and 2007. Dr. Margaret Hamilton leaned forward, becoming more interested. She worked as a professor during the day and spent her free time organizing historical documents for research. Recently, she had started studying a time period when child labor was common. The topic was very sad, but she kept her feelings controlled and faced it directly. William Thompson, her research assistant, was always enthusiastic, very different from herself. He always noticed small details, but never pushed for deep research unless it was really important. This new case seemed to be significant, at least to him. "Can we use computer face recognition on this old photograph to get more information?" William Thompson asked eagerly, maybe too excited. "If we could make this photograph clearer, it could really help our research. I've already written the request letter. I just need your permission." Dr. Margaret Hamilton thought about his request for a moment, then nodded briefly. William Thompson's unusual excitement was rare but interesting to see. For some reason, it gave her hope that they might discover something groundbreaking. She had no idea how right this feeling would turn out to be. 3 weeks later, Dr. Margaret Hamilton stared at her computer screen, comparing the enhanced image with other articles and pictures from the Lewis Hine collection. When she couldn't find anything important, she expanded her search to other areas, like weaving archives and medical journals. William Thompson had done most of the work, tracking down and interviewing everyone connected to this mysterious photograph. At first, their goal was to study the image and find out who Mary Ashworth was, since she was the only one of the 3 girls without any follow-up information. However, the more they studied the photo, the more their attention shifted from Mary Ashworth to Pearl, the youngest girl. For some reason, they both suspected something unusual about her and her story. Dr. Margaret Hamilton zoomed in on Pearl's image, examining every detail with careful attention. She studied her face, skin color, hair, and posture under the old brownish lighting, comparing every detail with the medical journals spread across her desk. After trying for 2 days, she finally made a breakthrough. The university's advanced computer imaging system had found something in the original photograph that had gone unnoticed for over a century. Her heart beat faster as she understood what they had discovered. "This changes everything we thought we knew about textile mill workers and their health," she whispered, reaching for her phone to call William Thompson. "Get me Dr. Charles Mitchell from the Medical History Department." That evening, Dr. Margaret Hamilton found herself speaking to a room full of professors and historians, many from the Medical History Department. Behind her, displayed on a huge screen, was the Lewis Hine photograph from 1912, digitally enhanced to show details invisible to regular eyesight. "Hello, everyone," she began. "What you're looking at might be one of the most important historical medical discoveries of the decade. 3 young girls photographed outside the Loray Mill in Gastonia, North Carolina, in 1912. Like thousands of children during that time, they worked long hours in dangerous conditions, constantly breathing in cotton fibers and dust that usually caused breathing diseases and early death." She clicked to the next slide, showing a close-up image of Pearl Turner's face. The audience leaned forward in their seats, trying to see the subtle details her team had found. Using advanced imaging technology developed for restoring artwork, we examined this photograph in incredible detail, she explained. What we discovered in the facial structure and visible skin markings of this 9-year-old girl, Pearl Turner, suggests she had a genetic variation that was never documented before. Whispered conversations started around the room. Professor Henry Watson, a leading genetics expert, shook his head in disbelief, but instead of voicing his doubts, he let Dr. Margaret Hamilton continue. "According to medical records we've collected, Pearl Turner lived until she was 66 years old, which was remarkably long for someone who began mill work at age 6 or 7, she continued. "Her sister Viola, however," she said, pointing to the girl on the right of the image, "died from tuberculosis just 4 years after this photo was taken, when she was only 17, and like her, 4 out of the 8 siblings died before reaching age 20. This difference within the same family made us ask our first questions." Dr. Margaret Hamilton clicked to the next slide, showing medical diagrams. "I believe Pearl Turner had a rare genetic variation that gave her increased resistance to the harmful effects of textile particles on lung tissue," she stated. "My theory is that she had a variant of the mCoNAR gene, which usually controls skin color and other genetic variations in people." Dr. Margaret Hamilton emphasized her argument by pointing out the difference in skin tone between the 2 sisters in the photo. At first glance, someone might think Pearl was of Indian descent because of her darker skin and features, she noted. However, that wasn't entirely the case. Beyond the usual skin and eye effects, studies have shown that some people with certain mCoNAR variants have lower sensitivity to pain, she said calmly, hoping to make her point clear. Notice these subtle facial features, the slightly wider nose structure and the unique eyelid pattern, she pointed out. These indicate what we now believe is an adaptive trait that developed in response to industrial working conditions. We don't know how, but Pearl's genes were somehow prepared in advance to resist the damaging effects of working in the mill. William Thompson addressed the room before adding his thoughts. Even though this is just one documented case, the professor believes it points to a fascinating possibility that human adaptation to industrial conditions happened much more quickly than we previously thought possible. This small meeting was just the beginning. For the interruption. Before we continue with the story, I kindly ask you to like the video and subscribe to this channel. It is very important for us, thank you very much. Although amazed by this new discovery, the scientists wanted more information that could help them in their research. It was while searching for more discoveries that they would accidentally stumble upon even more shocking findings. Within months, Dr. Margaret Hamilton found herself knocking on the door of Sarah Jenkins, Pearl Turner's daughter, who was now in her 70s. The elderly woman welcomed her into a simple living room, decorated with family photographs from different generations. Sarah Jenkins held the enhanced image of her mother as a child with shaking hands. Mama never understood why she lived longer than all her brothers and sisters, she said quietly. She used to say she was just too stubborn to die. Dr. Margaret Hamilton smiled. Stubborn, yes, but also special in ways she couldn't have known. She replied, Your mother's body had a unique way of handling the mill conditions that we're only beginning to understand now. Sarah Jenkins touched the photograph gently. The journey into memories was both sweet and sad. She told Dr. Stain, Margaret Hamilton, about her childhood, at least what she could remember of it. Pearl Turner married her father, Frank Jenkins, when she was 19 years old. They were both workers, so their lives revolved around the mill. When her older sister Ruth was born, Pearl quit her job at the mill. 3 years later, Sarah Jenkins was born, completing their family of 4. Growing up, the girls never lacked for much. Their house and school were provided by the mill owners. Also, everyone knew everyone else in this close community. Sarah Jenkins described a connection like no other, explaining how they could help neighbors in need with no strings attached. Life was good for them, but unfortunately, there were difficulties along the way, especially for Pearl, who had breathing problems from time to time. Sarah Jenkins grew up watching her mother's ongoing health problems while her father continued working at the mill. Pearl always stayed home, spending her time visiting with friends and knitting clothes for Sarah Jenkins and Ruth. It was always sad to watch, she recalled. Sarah Jenkins admitted that she hardly knew anything about her mother's family. Stories about her father's family were very clear, but her mother's stories were always filled with pain and darkness. Almost everyone on Pearl's side of the family had died by the time Sarah Jenkins was born. After fighting a deadly battle with gout, Pearl's father died. Pearl's mother, from shock, died of a stroke weeks later. Ruth was only 2 years old when this series of tragedies happened. Just like her grandparents, Sarah Jenkins's distant relatives from her mother's side were either lost, married away, or dead. She always blamed these misfortunes on the problems of a developing industrial past. But Dr. Margaret Hamilton had amazing news for her. Sarah Jenkins's mother's genes were almost like Superman's, especially her healing abilities. Sarah Jenkins looked at the photo of Pearl that she had never seen before. Even though it was quite faded, she could easily recognize her mother's small face. To think this little girl started getting used to those dangerous machines at such a young age, she said sadly. What's worse, exposure to these harsh conditions brought terrible consequences to her and the family for decades. Her heart hurt at the thought. She had breathing troubles her whole life, but unlike her brothers and sisters, she kept going, Sarah Jenkins said. That's what makes her so extraordinary, Dr. Margaret Hamilton replied. Despite the damage to her lungs, her body had mechanisms that allowed her to repair tissue in ways others couldn't. We believe she passed some of these traits to you and your sister Ruth. Sarah Jenkins looked up. Ruth died in 2008, she said. She had asthma her whole life, but she lived to be 82. Remarkable, Dr. Margaret Hamilton said quietly, taking notes. And you? I've had my problems, Sarah Jenkins admitted, but here I am. With Sarah Jenkins's permission, Dr. Margaret Hamilton's team collected DNA samples and compared them to historical records and medical histories of other mill worker families. Their findings exceeded even their highest expectations. Back at the university research laboratory, a team of scientists spent hours examining tissue samples under microscopes. Just as Dr. Margaret Hamilton had explained, there were genetic markers from Sarah Jenkins's DNA test that confirmed their theory. It was a genetic adaptation that allowed for improved lung tissue healing and cellular protection against particle damage. And all because we zoomed in on a century-old photograph, William Thompson said with amazement. If Lewis Hine hadn't captured that moment, those girls would have just been 3 more forgotten child workers. Instead, Dr. Margaret Hamilton concluded, they've given us a window into human adaptation that could help us develop new treatments for work-related lung diseases. After sharing her findings, word spread throughout the medical and science departments. By fall, Dr. Margaret Hamilton found herself addressing a packed auditorium at the Academic Conference on Historical Disease Studies in Boston. The discovery changed the old Loray Mill itself, which had now been converted to expensive apartments. It housed a small museum dedicated to its industrial past. In the center of the main exhibit stood a large print of the Lewis Hine photograph, surrounded by the story of the discovery and what it meant. Tourists gathered around as a guide explained the importance. Soon, everyone in the scientific community was talking about Pearl Turner, the young girl who had a genetic variation that allowed her to survive conditions that killed many of her peers, including her own sister. By 2015, Dr. Margaret Hamilton's research had grown from historical curiosity to medical breakthrough. At the Medical Research Conference in Atlanta, she spoke to a room of scientists and pharmaceutical researchers. Pearl's condition, which they had collectively named Hamilton syndrome, was introduced as a specific genetic variation that improves cellular repair mechanisms in lung tissue exposed to dangerous particles. The discovery had already led to 2 experimental treatments for work-related lung diseases, both of which were showing remarkable promise. Some critics claimed Dr. Margaret Hamilton and her team were making too much of a single case, but Dr. Margaret Hamilton ignored the voices of doubt around her. For her, science often began with a single observation that didn't fit the expected pattern. The connection with this case was obviously clear. Pearl Turner lived while her siblings died young. That unusual situation deserved investigation. What we found since the beginning of our research, similar genetic markers in descendants of industrial workers from the Southeast, confirms our initial findings, she told an inquiry panel when challenged. I don't believe I'm making too much of this case. By 2022, clinical trials were completed, and the first treatment, based on Hamilton syndrome, was approved for widespread use. It made headlines in medical and scientific publications, marking the beginning of a new era of change in work-related lung disease treatment. Below the headline was the Lewis Hine photograph. 3 young girls standing in front of a building, their expressions serious and their futures uncertain. Margaret Hamilton learned an important lesson from this situation. Behind every historical photograph, every statistic about child labor and industrial conditions, were real children with real bodies trying to survive. Some, like Viola Turner, couldn't adapt quickly enough. Others, like Pearl, found a way without even knowing it. Did you enjoy this story? Would you keep looking for answers, even if others said you were wasting your time? Let us know in the comments below. If you liked the story, subscribe to this channel and leave a like. Never give up on what you believe is important. Thanks so much for listening. See you in the next video. Have a great day.